When someone who leans avoidant begins to create physical and digital distance, it's often the clearest signal that they are intentionally disengaging from the connection. And when that space goes from temporary to permanent, it's no longer about needing time to think or space to breathe. It becomes about eliminating emotional proximity altogether. This is not just a coping mechanism for discomfort, it's often the beginning of a quiet exit. Avoidants have a deeply ingrained response to emotional closeness. They crave it, but also fear it. But when they've made the decision that the relationship is no longer something they want to pursue, their instinct isn't to argue or fight. It's to retreat, not with drama or bold statements, but with subtle, consistent avoidance. One of the first things they do is reduce or completely cut your access to them. They stop going to the places they know you might be. They shift their habits. They unfollow, mute, or stop engaging on social platforms. They disappear from digital spaces where they once consistently showed up. What's important to understand is that this is not accidental. It's not them being busy or distracted. It's a conscious effort to separate themselves from the reminders of you. That silence doesn't mean they're processing. It often means they're done processing. There's a myth we often tell ourselves that when someone stops responding or disappears, it's because they're confused or scared or figuring out their feelings. But avoidance doesn't always come from confusion. Sometimes it comes from certainty, not the kind they announce or explain, but the kind they act on quietly by removing themselves. You'll notice this shift not just in their behavior, but in your own experience of reaching them, where once there was consistent communication, texts that came quickly, interactions that felt natural, there is now a delay, or worse, nothing at all. You may find yourself looking at your phone wondering if they saw your message. You might catch yourself rereading your last words, trying to figure out what could have pushed them further away. But the truth is, the pushing has already happened on their end. They are actively drawing a line between the life they are continuing to live and the part of it you once occupied. Physical distance plays into this just as much. If you live in the same city or share a social circle, you may notice that they've started avoiding places you used to go together. They aren't showing up to mutual gatherings. They're not taking the same routes. They've adjusted their world in ways that ensure fewer chances of bumping into you. It's not about fear of confrontation. It's about reducing emotional friction. They don't want to be reminded of the emotional closeness they once had with you because they've already compartmentalized it and moved on. What's tricky is that many people mistake this distance for self-protection. They think maybe the avoidant person is overwhelmed, unsure, or retreating temporarily to regain control. That would be true in a scenario where the person still felt emotionally tethered. But when the emotional detachment has become permanent, the distance isn't temporary self-soothing. It's them making space for a version of their life where the relationship no longer exists. They are dismantling the emotional infrastructure that held you in place. Even in the age of constant digital presence, where people check their phones countless times a day and are always just a tap away, an avoidant person who's truly done will choose silence over response. They won't just stop calling or texting. They'll stop showing up in small, habitual ways. They'll disappear from the shared playlist you both contributed to. They'll stop watching your stories. They might still be online, but their online presence becomes an entirely separate world, one that doesn't include you anymore. And then there's the absence of shared moments. Before, they might have sent you something random, an article, a meme, a thought, something that said, "I'm thinking of you," even in the quiet. When that stops, when all casual outreach disappears, it's not because they're unsure what to say. It's because they don't want to say anything anymore. They've withdrawn their investment in small emotional currencies that once built the bridge between you. It's painful to witness this unfold, especially when your instinct is to hold on, to reach out, to try to re-establish a connection that once felt effortless. But each attempt is met with less and less engagement. Your messages start to feel like they're dropping into a void. Not because the person is incapable of seeing them, but because they are intentionally choosing not to respond, not to punish you, not to manipulate, but because, in their world, they are no longer participating in the emotional dialogue that once existed between you. When you care about someone who's emotionally avoidant, one of the most painful experiences is trying to connect with them and being met with a wall. You try to express something real, a vulnerable thought, a feeling, even a gentle check-in. And what you get back isn't warmth, it isn't care, it's indifference. Not anger, not confusion, just a kind of cold, flat, emotional distance that leaves you feeling like you're the only one who still feels anything at all. People in avoidant patterns often struggle with emotional intimacy, but there's a difference between someone who is avoidant and conflicted and someone who is avoidant and done. And when they've truly checked out, when they're not coming back, the most common and telling sign is that your emotional outreach doesn't land. It doesn't move them. It barely seems to register. Maybe you try to be brave and say something honest like, "I've been thinking about you," or "It's been hard not hearing from you." And instead of curiosity or care, they respond with something flat like, "Hope you're doing well," or "Thanks for checking in." Those are not words of someone who is sitting with regret. Those are not the messages of someone who is emotionally entangled, torn, or looking for an opening to reconnect. Those are messages of emotional finality. This isn't about demonizing someone who has avoidant tendencies, but we do have to be honest with ourselves about what someone's lack of emotional engagement means. If every time you reach out, you find yourself overthinking the tiniest details of their brief response, looking for hidden meaning in their lack of punctuation, their emoji choices, their response time, you are not in a dialogue. You are alone in a guessing game where the other person isn't even playing. And here's where it gets really hard, because if you're emotionally invested, you probably have a deep desire to reconnect, to fix, to make things make sense. And so when they respond in a distant or disinterested way, your mind wants to interpret that distance as temporary, as something they're doing because they're scared or confused or unsure. You tell yourself they just need time, or they don't know how to process their emotions, or maybe if I say the right thing, I can get through to them. But if someone repeatedly meets your emotional check-ins with indifference, it's not confusion on their part. It's clarity, not for you, for them. They've already made a decision emotionally, and in many cases, they may not even feel they need to say it out loud. That's another way avoidant individuals operate when they've disconnected. They let their lack of warmth speak for them. They believe that by showing no interest, they're making their position obvious. And while that may seem cruel to the person who's still emotionally involved, it's often how an avoidant person avoids confrontation. They're hoping you'll eventually get the message, without them needing to be the one to deliver it in plain language. What makes this especially complicated is that they might still respond. They might not block you. They might not disappear completely. But each time you try to go deeper, each time you try to bring the conversation back to something real, to something emotionally meaningful, they deflect, they minimize, they talk around it, or worse, they make you feel needy for trying to connect. And the more you attempt to bridge the distance, the more they tighten their emotional grip. Not in a way that brings you closer, but in a way that reinforces the boundary they've now set. You'll notice they don't ask questions. They don't express curiosity about how you've been. They don't remember the little things anymore. There's a cold efficiency in their responses, like they're being polite, but only just enough to not be rude. And if you're honest with yourself, you'll see that your emotional investment is being met with emotional vacancy. Not hostility, not passion, just absence. This absence isn't neutral, it's deeply informative. Because when someone still has feelings, even if they're confused, even if they're hurt, they can't help but show signs of emotional disruption when you reach out. There's a tension, a conflicted energy, but when someone is done, they become immune to your vulnerability. It doesn't move them, it doesn't touch them. You could write the most heartfelt message, and it wouldn't prompt more than a lukewarm reply, if anything at all. And that's not by accident. That's not emotional immaturity. That's someone who is already detached. When an avoidant person no longer feels emotionally attached, one of the most telling behaviors is their complete lack of curiosity about your life. You could be going through major life changes, meeting new people, traveling, or healing from the breakup itself, and they won't ask a single question, they won't reach out, they won't check in, they won't even show a flicker of interest. And this is not because they're playing a game or trying to hide how they feel, it's because they genuinely don't feel the need to know. When someone is still emotionally invested, even in the smallest way, curiosity lingers. There's a pull that makes them want to understand what you're doing, who you're with, what you're feeling. But when that's gone, silence replaces interest. For someone who's naturally avoidant, emotional distance is their comfort zone. So when they've emotionally detached, the desire to monitor your life vanishes. They don't ask who you're seeing, they don't wonder if you've moved on, and they certainly don't try to gauge if there's still space for them in your life. This can be incredibly confusing, especially if you're the type of person who associates silence with inner turmoil. You might tell yourself they're staying quiet because it hurts too much to ask. You imagine that maybe they're avoiding the topic because the idea of you being with someone else is too difficult. But the painful truth in many of these situations is that they aren't asking because they've already let go. Even if you post something that's clearly designed to get a reaction, a new photo with someone, a cryptic quote, a visual cue that you're living your life without them, they won't engage. They don't take the bait. They don't reply. They don't like or comment. They don't make any move that might suggest they're watching because in many cases they're not. And if they are, they're doing it quietly with no emotional intention behind it. They might scroll past your story, see your face, and feel nothing. That's how far gone their emotional investment is when they've truly checked out. One of the clearest signs that an avoidant is not coming back is this lack of emotional reactivity. When someone still has feelings, even if they're avoidant, they struggle to ignore what you're doing. They feel conflicted, they might ghost you one week, then reach out the next, just to test the waters. They might react to your posts, even subtly, just to re-establish presence. But when they're done, those fluctuations stop. They become consistent in their absence, and that consistency isn't random. It's a sign of emotional resolution. This absence of jealousy or inquiry doesn't mean they've reached some enlightened state where they're at peace and wish you well from afar. It means you're no longer in their emotional landscape. And while that can sound cold or even cruel, it's not necessarily personal. Avoidant individuals often operate in extremes. They're either close and conflicted or distant and detached. Once the switch has flipped and they've chosen detachment, they don't linger in the gray areas. They move on in a way that can feel abrupt, even if that process was building internally for a long time. It's also worth noting that this lack of jealousy or interest is especially significant because avoidant people by nature dislike vulnerability. So for them to show any jealousy at all requires them to confront emotions they usually avoid. If they were still emotionally attached, they'd find it difficult to suppress those reactions. You'd see it in subtle ways, in their questions, their tone, their behavior. They'd be uncomfortable, but still engaged. So when even that discomfort disappears, it's because the emotional charge is gone. They no longer feel threatened by the idea of you moving on, because they've already psychologically stepped away. People who are still emotionally invested can't help but want to know how their absence is affecting you. They check in, even if it's indirectly. They test boundaries. They want to see if they still matter. But when an avoidant person no longer does any of that, when they stop being even remotely interested in your life, it's not because they're protecting themselves from pain, it's because they've closed the door. And they're not waiting for it to open again. They've chosen to live on the other side of that door without checking if you're still standing there. One of the most difficult truths to accept after a breakup with an avoidant partner is the absence of visible conflict. When someone is still emotionally tied to you, even if they're avoidant by nature, there's usually some level of inner struggle. You'll see it in their actions that contradict their silence, in the hesitation, in their voice, in the inconsistency of their behavior. They might pull away, but they still peek back in. They might say they need space, but they still want to know if you're thinking about them. That inner tug of war is a sign that they haven't let go. But when that conflict disappears, when there's no contradiction, no friction, no emotional storm underneath the surface, it's often because they've already made peace with leaving. And that peace is the clearest indicator that they're not coming back. An avoidant person who's done doesn't seem upset. They don't seem shaken. In fact, they may appear calmer than ever, which can feel disorienting. You might be in the depths of heartbreak, questioning everything, while they're going about their life with an unsettling sense of normalcy. It's not that they weren't affected by the breakup. It's that the emotional processing happened long before you even realized there was a problem. Avoidants often begin detaching emotionally long before they physically or verbally end the relationship. So by the time things fall apart, they're already steps ahead in their healing. That calm you see isn't grace, it's closure. And not the kind that's shared in a heartfelt conversation. It's the private kind, the kind that's resolved quietly without needing to involve you. This lack of inner conflict shows up in how they respond to communication. When someone is still emotionally torn, they might take hours or days to reply to a simple message, not because they're playing games, but because they genuinely don't know how to respond. There's a hesitation, a questioning of how their words will be received, of what they really want. But when that hesitation disappears and they become strangely efficient, even robotic, in their replies, or worse, they just stop replying altogether, it's often because there is no emotional struggle left. They've settled the question within themselves. There's also an emotional neutrality that begins to replace what was once reactive energy. You may notice that they no longer get defensive, no longer try to justify their choices, and no longer care to explain why they've become distant. This isn't emotional maturity, it's emotional finality. When someone doesn't care how you interpret their silence or how you perceive their decisions, it's not detachment with hope, it's detachment with certainty. They're no longer trying to control how they're seen because they've already stepped out of the story. When someone is still emotionally connected to you, there's often tension between their desire to maintain distance and their inability to fully disconnect. You feel it in the hot and cold behavior, the moments of warmth followed by sudden withdrawal, the confusing mix of closeness and retreat. But when they've reached a place of emotional resolution, that tension disappears. There are no more late-night texts, no more passive likes on your posts, no more reaching out under the guise of checking in. Instead, there's a noticeable stillness, a quiet that feels heavy, not because of what's being said, but because of what's not. It's incredibly tempting to interpret this calmness as emotional repression, to tell yourself they're just really good at hiding their feelings. But the more accurate explanation, especially in the case of avoidance, is that they've emotionally offloaded the connection. They've already done the work, internally, privately, and likely without ever telling you. And now they no longer feel the pull. The decisions they're making don't come from hesitation or regret. They come from conviction. You'll notice they no longer resist closure conversations, but they also don't initiate them. They're willing to talk if you insist, but they don't need it. They don't ask questions. They don't express regret. They don't seem to miss the relationship, not because it meant nothing to them, but because they've packaged the emotions and put them away. That packaging is their way of creating control. And once it's done, it's done. This absence of emotional conflict isn't a temporary phase. It's not a sign that they're taking a break to find themselves before they come back. It's not the quiet before a dramatic return. It's the evidence that their emotional journey has reached its end, and they are no longer wrestling with whether or not you should be in their life. When someone with an avoidant attachment style decides they're done, their behavior becomes marked by a deep emotional self-containment. They stop seeking connection, stop explaining themselves, and most significantly, stop showing any signs of vulnerability. Vulnerability is one of the greatest indicators of emotional investment. It shows up in the form of regret, reflection, discomfort, awkwardness, any sign that they are emotionally affected. But once they've emotionally disengaged, that vulnerability disappears completely. You don't see any cracks, no slips, no clues that they're struggling with the separation. And that isn't because they've mastered their emotions, it's because they've shut the door on them. An avoidant who is still emotionally tied to the relationship might struggle to maintain distance. They might go cold for a few days, then suddenly reach out with a vague message, as if testing whether the line is still open. Even if they don't say much, even if they're not willing to engage in a full conversation, their emotional conflict seeps through in subtle ways. But when the avoidant person has truly let go, there's a kind of emotional neatness to their absence. It's not chaotic, it's not emotional, it's measured, clean, and eerily composed. They're not being distant because they're trying to protect themselves. They're being distant because they don't feel the need to engage anymore. This absence of vulnerability is one of the most painful things to experience, especially if you're someone who craves emotional resolution. You might be sitting with the ache of unanswered questions, wrestling with everything that was left unsaid, hoping they'll eventually acknowledge the significance of what you had. You imagine they must be feeling something too, that deep down they're just as impacted as you are, but they're hiding it. You hope that at some point the silence will break and you'll hear that they've been thinking about it all along. But when an avoidant is truly done, that emotional honesty never comes. Not because they're afraid to express it, because there's nothing left they feel compelled to express. They won't initiate a conversation about what went wrong. They won't circle back to apologize or reflect. They won't sit with you in the discomfort of a vulnerable exchange. They've already closed that chapter internally. To reopen it would require them to re-engage with feelings they've already decided not to carry. Vulnerability for them is only necessary when there's still an emotional need. And once that need vanishes, so does the openness. Even when given the opportunity to be vulnerable, when you reach out, when you ask heartfelt questions, when you express your own pain, they won't match it. They'll either respond in a way that's overly practical or simply avoid the subject altogether. You might say something that invites emotional honesty, and their response will be so emotionally flat it feels like a slap. Not cruel, not dismissive, just empty. As if you were trying to open a door that no longer exists. Avoidants who are still conflicted might let themselves have moments of messiness. They might confess that they miss you late at night. They might admit that they're confused. They might not know what they want, but at least they show signs of still caring. They show humanity. They show evidence of emotional processing. But when someone has moved on, they become emotionally airtight. You could throw your most honest words at them and they would take nothing in. They don't argue. They don't cry. They don't reflect. They stay emotionally sealed, not as a defense mechanism, but as a declaration, one they make through silence rather than speech. You may want to believe that their lack of vulnerability is a front, that they're fighting something inside and just don't know how to express it. And in some cases, early on, that may be true. But over time, you'll start to see a pattern. They don't stumble. They don't send mixed signals. They're not trying to process anything with you anymore. They're just gone. The same person who once shared moments of softness, of closeness, of emotional intimacy, now seems like a stranger. Not because they've become someone else, but because they've returned to their default emotional setting, a place where feelings are compartmentalized, buried, and put away for good. This absence of vulnerability isn't just about their unwillingness to open up to you. It's about their unwillingness to engage with any emotional narrative that still involves you. When someone avoids vulnerability, they also avoid accountability. They don't want to explore what they did wrong. They don't want to examine their part in the disconnect. They don't want to acknowledge what was lost. Because in their world, the easiest way to move on is to pretend nothing of emotional substance remains. And when that becomes their reality, no matter how much you try to reach into it, you find that there's nothing left to hold on to.